Welcome to the Winter 2020 English Reading Series. This is our 21st year of the series. We are beyond thrilled to have 2010 Pulitzer Prize winner Paul Harding with us today. Thank you all for joining us. The English Reading Series is sponsored by the Department of English and the College of Humanities with help from Rebecca Casanave and Robert Means and our friends at the library. We will start today with a prayer by Joe Worthman, and following the prayer, Chanel Earl will offer an introduction. Also, please join us next week for a reading by Rick Barrett. Joe, when you're ready.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to be gathered together with technology to listen to the work by Paul Harding, and we ask you to please help us to learn something new and to be able to apply that knowledge to our lives. We are grateful for all that was done for us, and we love thee, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Hello, it is a privilege to introduce Paul Harding today. He is not only an award-winning novelist, but also an accomplished musician, a studied theologian, a committed teacher who I learned this morning is currently mentoring 15 students through their thesis projects, and a generous person, willing to share his time, talents, and experience with others. His third novel, titled This Other Eden, will be published later this year, and I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Paul Harding to the English Reading Series.
Thank you, Chanel, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks, Joe, for the prayer. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is all safe and healthy and keeping your spirits up. It's a wonderful privilege and joy to be here with you today. And I'm grateful that you've invited me to be a part of your English reading series. As you just heard, today I'm going to read from a forthcoming novel. When it's forthcoming, who knows? The pandemic has put such things in question. The novel is called This Other Eden, which, for those interested, is a line from Richard II, Shakespeare, when John of Gaunt is lamenting the situation of England, and he calls England this earth of majesty, the seat of Mars. This other Eden is now leased out like a tenement or a pelting farm. So my novel is very, very, very loosely inspired by an island off the southern coast of Maine, which was site to a settlement, a racially integrated settlement from roughly 1793 until 1912, when the inhabitants of the island were summarily evicted from the island. I'm going to basically read the opening scene. Usually, I guess I have a reputation for writing very quiet, introspective novels, and I think this novel has that. But I thought that it would be fun then for me to try to open a novel with a big operatic tour de force set piece, just for the fun of it. So I'm going to read you that. So this is kind of a wild ride full of sound and fury, and it's meant to be fun. It's the context in which it appears in the narrative is sort of as a retelling of like a local myth or a local legend. So it's exaggerated and has this kind of quality of tall tale about it. I was talking with some of the MFA students earlier today, and I said, oh, it uses a lot of that figure of speech where you start sentences with the same word over and over again. I couldn't think of what that figure of speech is, and it's anaphora. And you see that in the Bible, and this and that, and blessings on this and blessings on that, grace to this, grace to that. So there's a lot of that going on here. This is meant to be this is the opening of the novel, and it's sort of, I think of it also as like a local flood narrative. So it echoes Noah and Moses and Shakespeare's The Tempest and Melville's Moby Dick, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. So, here it is. Benjamin Honey, born enslaved, then freed or fled, then a ship's carpenter, aspiring orchardist nearly as long as he could remember, arrived on the island with his wife, Patience, in 1793. He brought his bag of tools, given as a gift by the captain he saved from shipwreck or stolen from the ship on which he was a mutineer and possibly conspirator in the captain's murder, depending on who said, and a watertight wooden box inside which were 12 jute pouches. Each pouch contained the seeds for a different variety of apple. Honey collected the seeds during his years as a field worker and later as a sailor. He remembered being in an orchard as a child, although not where or when, almost certainly with his mother or with a woman whose face over the years became what he pictured as his mother's. And he remembered the fragrance of the trees and their fruit. The memory became a vision of the garden to which he meant to return. No mystery, it was Eden. Years passed and he added seeds to his collection. He recited the names at night before he slept. Ashmead's Colonel, Flower of Kent, the Duchess of Orange and Warner's King, Ballyfatten and Cat's Head. When Benjamin and Patience arrived on the island, uninhabited then, the only human artifact, an abandoned Penobscot shell berm, and after the couple had settled enough and he planted the seeds, not a single one sprouted. He was so infuriated by his own ignorance that over the next year he made trips to the mainland whenever he could spare some time and sought out orchards and their owners and traded his carpentry skills for seeds and advice about how they grew and how to cultivate the trees and their fruit. Benjamin and Patience and their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters and great-grandchildren kept more and more to the island as time passed. But in the final years of the 18th century, it was not as dangerous as it came to be for a Creole man to range the countryside. Any able-bodied adult who could lend a hand surviving was accepted. So the story went among his descendants. So Benjamin rambled around and found farms where he could help raise a barn or split shingles or clear an acre for crops, and came home with seeds that quickened and struck roots and elaborated themselves into the shapes of his remembered garden. Roxbury russets, Rhode Island greenings, woodpeckers, and Newton pippins. Benjamin Honey kept an orchard of 32 apple trees that began to bear fruit in the late summer of 1814, a decade after he planted them. Pippins were perfect for pies, woodpeckers for cider. Children bit sour greenings on dares and laughed at one another with watering eyes and puckered mouths. Russets were best straight from the tree. Benjamin Honey surveyed his orchard in the cooling air and sharpening, iridescent, ocean-bent sunset light, the lowering greens and purples deepening from their radiant, flat, day bright into catacombs of shadowed fruit and limb and leaf. It felt as if his mother were somewhere among the trees. She might appear from behind a tree in a white Sunday dress that took up the shifting colors and smile at him. He inhaled the perfume, salted as everything on the island, and took a bite of the apple he held. The cool, sugary fruit tasted like hope fully ripened and almost too perfect to believe. People began to call the island Apple Island. In September of 1815, 24 years after Benjamin and Patience Honey had come to the island, when by then there were nearly 30 people living there in 5 or 6 houses, including the first Proverbs and Lark folks, the ones from Angola and Cape Verde, the others from Edinburgh. Patience Honey herself from Galway, Ireland originally, before she met Benjamin on his way through Nova Scotia and went with him. And there are 3 Penobscot women, sisters who'd lost their parents when they were little girls. In September of 1815, a hurricane struck, and a surge of seawater 20 feet high funneled up the bay, sweeping houses and ships along with it. When the wall of ocean hit, it tore half the trees and all the houses off the island, guzzling everything down, along with 2 honeys, 3 proverbs, 1 of the Penobscot sisters, 3 dogs, 6 cats, and a single woebegone goat named Enoch. The hurricane roared so loudly, Patience Honey thought she'd gone deaf at first. That is, until she heard the tidal mountain avalanching up the bay, bristling with houses and ships and trees and people and cows and horses all churning inside it, screaming and bursting and lowing and neighing and shattering and heading right for the island. Then she knew all might well be lost, that this might well be the judgment of exaltation, the sealed message unsealing, that after they'd all been swept away by the broom of extermination, there'd be so few trees left standing, a young child would be able to count them up, and their folks would be scarcer than gold. But not all gone, not everyone. Patience knew. Some honeys would persist, some proverbs survive. A lark or two might endure. So for reasons she could never afterward explain, she snatched the homemade flag she'd stitched together from patches of the stars and stripes and the Portuguese crown and golden Irish harp shaped like a woman who looked so much like a figurehead on a ship, and the pair of faded faint squares with Ethiopian saints embroidered on them that Benjamin had carried with him everywhere and that he always said were his great-grandfather's, although Patience in her heart of hearts didn't think that that could be true. She took that flag and tied it like a scarf around her throat. And she took Benjamin by the hand and dragged him from their shack out into the whirlwind. She swore it was a premonition because no sooner was she and her husband passing out the door than the entire house broke loose from its pilings and tumbled away behind them, bouncing and breaking apart into straw like a bale of hay bouncing off a rick, undone and rolling down the hill. Now that she stood out in the open facing the bedlam, her legs suddenly would not work. She was sure that this was the judgment, and what was to be was to be. It was useless to try to outrun the outstretched arm of the Lord. Benjamin roared to her over the roaring storm, the tree, and he pointed to the tallest tree on the island, the Penobscot pine, at the top of the bluff. Benjamin pointed and leaned his face toward his wife's and pointed up the tree. Wind plastered his shirt and the rain lashed and streamed down his face and ran from his hair. And lightning broke across the sky and thunder blasted against the earth and sea. And he roared again over the roaring storm, the tree. And Patience thought of their grown children and their young grandchildren and cried to her husband, the children. And Benjamin looked beyond his wife, and there were their children and grandchildren, making their way against the winds and lashing rains, the ocean rising now up to the window of the lark's old shack and pouring into it through the broken panes, and the largest surging waves thundering nearly up to where his own house had stood not 2 minutes before, and sucking all the earth right off the very rocks and into the black and gray and brooding jade Atlantic. And he cried, go to the tree. And he ran towards his grown children and young grandchildren and grabbed 2 of the little ones from their mothers and carried each one under his arms and ran toward the tree. And the wind roared and spun, and they staggered against it, now nearly blown toward the bluff, now nearly blown back away from it. When they reached the tree, one of Benjamin and Patience's sons, I think she always said it was Thomas, stood on Benjamin's shoulders, and the other sons and daughters climbed up the 2 men and reached the lowest branches of the old tree. And once they got their footing, as best as they could in the middle of such bedlam, the others tossed the children up to them one by one. Once Patience had climbed into the tree, and Thomas followed her up from Benjamin's shoulders, Benjamin himself scaled the trunk like the mast of a ship and roared once more, as high as you can all climb. And all the honeys in that old tree climbed with all their strength, the children screaming and crying, the men and women screaming and crying, until the whole soaked clan clung together into the trunk in a trembling, grasping cluster at the top of that swaying, bending, mighty old tree, snapping back and forth in the wind like a whip. And right then, they all heard a greater thunder rumble from the clamor, and the whole island quaked under them, telegraphing their extinction. And at that moment, Patience Honey, holding one of her grandbabies tight as could be against her side with one arm and clenching the tree with the other, looked to the south, down the bay, and there she saw that barbed sierra of ocean, full of all the trees and buildings and shrieking people and wagons and sloops and schooners, with an old sea captain named Burnham in his pilot coat, rowing a dinghy on the blazing crest of it all, smoking a pipe, bowl down to keep the water out, and crying for mad joy at this last rapturous pileup, and all of it, that great massif of water and ruin, speeding right for the honeys in their tree, which now seemed like a twig, a toothpick, a drenched blade of grass set against the immensity of that heaving mountain range of ocean demolition. What always was so eerie about it afterwards, Patience always said, what was so terrifying about it that made her bowels feel as if they'd turned to sand, was how quiet it all seemed, like a breath drawn and held right before it hit, how breathtakingly fast but nearly silent, and so just plain beautiful it was. All those people and trees and ships and horses cartwheeling past within the billows. It wasn't silent really, but more so loud it was too big to hear. I could not hear it, Patience used to say, for that second, because it was just too big a sound for my ears to hear. The water hit the south shore of the island first and swallowed it whole and smooth. Then it hit the jagged bedrock spine running up the middle of the island and broke over it, hissing like a saw blade. When it struck the slope of the bluff, it exploded across the horizon in front of the islanders in the tree and hung up and suspended for a moment in an apocalyptic entablature that Patience afterwards always said looked in that instant before it all collapsed back together and swept along, how the parted sea must have appeared to the poor Israelites. I was pretty well given up on it all. And in that tree, holding it so hard, the bark cut into my arms and gave me these scars. And holding that baby so hard against me, I thought I'd crack it, drenched to the marrow and screaming and trying not to let go. But when that tower of ocean and ruination burst apart in front of me in a blink, but as deep as my soul, I saw a broad, dry avenue running through the middle of the sea. And it was thronged with shepherds and sheep and old ladies on donkeys, and litters of children curled up asleep on hay in beds of rickety carts. The checked ocean towered on both sides, sheer, smooth, and monolithic. And inside the water, a pell-mell cavalcade of Egyptian men and horses and chariots scrolled past within an invisible current, tumbling heel over headdress, fetlock over cannon, bumper over shaft. Most of the men wore linen tunics, but some wore leopard skins and feathers and had elaborate headdresses. Some of them were tethered to their chariots by leather reins and held longbows. Arrows and spears twirled among the men and horses and cars. Although many of their black-lined eyes stared wide open, they all clearly were drowned. And I knew what it was like when God parted the sea. And I knew that Moses was way up there at the front of the line. Not like the idea of Moses, but the man himself, the very man, Moses, when God opened the ocean. Then the waters collected all the relic and rubble back up and swept over the rest of the island. The water churned and rose up the Penobscot pine laden with the honeys. Patience looked down through the branches and limbs and watched the seething waters rise over her children's and grandchildren's feet, billow up their skirts and rise over their midriffs and up their exposed throats, then into their sputtering mouths. And she watched their hair soak up the boiling waters, and she watched the waters swill Benjamin up too, and she watched her daughter, Charity Honey, wrench free from the tree and tumble away in the wreckage, clutching her baby son David in her arms. And the waters reached her feet, and she felt something deep down in the bottom of the tree crack and give, and the tree bowed, and she was in the swift and roaring waters up to her waist. Then the tree levered itself back upright. Though it seemed not to swallow at her quite as greedily as it first had, the water still rose and it reached Patience's collarbone. And Patience always said she could just still see the top of Benjamin's head below her in the water, serene almost becalmed, tiny bubbles of air rising from his hair. And it was then, just as the water touched at her throat, that Patience remembered the old flag she'd sewn for Benjamin from bits and pieces of other flags and national rags and bedraggled patches, not long after they'd married and first settled their now drowning island, still tied around her neck. She always said later, I just decided right then that if we were all going to judgment, I was going to fly our little flag until the last possible second. So I hoisted that baby up even more and pressed it between the tree and my breast harder than I ever would have dared, and freed my hand and somehow unknotted the flag from my neck and held it in my hand and held my hand up just as high as I could get it. And the wind took the flag up and snapped it and practically tore it from my grasp, but I kept hold and there it flew. Then the water rose over the baby, who'd gone past wailing and just stared, wedged between my body and the tree, dumbfounded at the pandemonium, wide-eyed and quiet as it burbled under. And the water reached my mouth and covered my face and went over my head. And I still held that foolish flag as high as I could, and the water rose up my shoulder, and the water rose up to my raised elbow, and the water rose up my forearm, and the water reached my wrist. And so there was just my one hand holding that motley little tattered flag sticking up above the surface of the flood. And the waters rose up my fingers. And just as my hand was about to disappear and that flag and all us honeys be swallowed up in the catastrophe, the water stopped rising. The surge struck the innermost of the bay, spilled onto the mainland, dumping the foremost of the ruin it had plowed along the way onto a campsite called Little Shell Cove, where 100 years later, campers still turned up trinkets from the calamity, and the cauldron of wrath doubled back on itself and withdrew, quaffing the people, creatures, pie safes, pews, and cat boats it had failed to devour the first time, caterwauling off toward the horizon. The water stopped rising and seemed to pause. It was as if Patience's hand and the sputtering flag were at the center of a great whirlpool, guzzling the island down its throat. But then the eddying slowed and stopped, and the whirlpool began to uncoil. Patience Honey clung to the Penobscot pine under the water, the baby in her arms limp, eyes closed then, asleep against her breast inside the rising bosom of the sea. Patience looked down the length of the tree into the garbled dark. Bodies clung to it below. Benjamin, her cousin and best friend, Shekinah Goodfellow. Deeper down, the island appeared to move. It began to revolve around a tree like a dark stone wheel around a wooden axle. Patience saw it was a whale, circling, nosing at her and the other refugees newly arrived at his country, until he caught sight of an ancient great white shark cruising through the schoolhouse, trolling for drowned children and spinster teachers. The whale launched after its prehistoric nemesis, and the monsters jetted away from the shallows of the newly drowned world back to the proper abyss. I could no longer hold my breath, Patience would recall. Just as I had to give out and inhale the Atlantic into my lungs and swallow it into my guts like a last meal of saltwater soup, the whirlpool began to uncoil from around my hand and the flag, and the water began to lower. My arms seemed to rise out of the water, then my head and my body, along with the Penobscot pine, too, which rose like the mast of a ship unsinking. The ship, the island, and I surfaced and rose above the water, and the wind dashed against my face, and I gasped at the air, and I lost hold of the tree. Patience shucked herself from the mud and sand in which she lay face down at the base of the tree. The infant under her unrecognizable, not even clearly boy or girl, just a naked, wrung out, beslimed little pup squashed into the hummus. She poked a finger into its mouth to unplug the earth from its throat. Its nose was clogged too, so she sealed her mouth over the baby's whole face and sucked as hard as she dared, and the muck uncorked and spattered into her mouth. She spat to the side and watched the child. The infant belched a ladleful of seawater, opened its eyes, which seemed as if they did not see, opened its mouth, and for a moment lay petrified and silent. It barked and gurgled and gathered its breath and shrieked. The baby shrieked and shrieked, and Patience thumbed gunk from its eyes and ears and looked at her husband. Benjamin Honey was pressed into the mud and debris, face up, staring at the low clouds, sizzling and flashing overhead. Patience knew what he was thinking. She saw his hope and heart draining into the ocean with their lost children and grandchildren and with his apple trees. Those trees that he labored so long and so hard at because they reminded him of the one place he remembered being with his mother when he was a little boy. Grief overtook her, and as she began to panic and cry hysterically and scrambled up looking for who else was left, the baby still howling too, she looked at her husband, who had come from nowhere and taken her away from nowhere to try to find somewhere together, who she had loved the moment she first saw him, and she knew she had to fetch him back from the brink of the pit. It's still Apple Island, she screamed, crying the name over wind and wailing child, and through her own wailing that now felt like it was erupting straight from her heart, spouting from her in gouts as she searched in every direction for her children and their children. It is Apple Island. It is Apple Island. Benjamin Honey looked at his wife crying to him, fierce and true. He loved her more than ever before, but she was wrong. Those he planted had been the apples of Sodom, Dead Sea fruit, so fair in appearance, but no sooner grasped than dissolved into smoke and ashes. I'll end there.
Thanks so much. That's a magnificent set piece, like you said. I say this every week, but even though Zoom sure is great, I wish you at this interlude could hear the applause of the 130 plus people here right now.
Oh, that's great. I'm used to it. Used to that Zoom world.
Well, then let's move into the Q&A.
Sure.
I'll start here with a question from Blair. Do you find yourself working and reworking sentences to perfect the poetry of the prose, its rhythm and sound, or is your process more fluid? How long would you typically spend on one passage?
Thank you for the question. I revise obsessively. I was a drummer in a former life, so I write very intuitively, very improvisationally. I often know what the rhythm and the beat and the sort of time signature of a sentence is before I know what it literally means. So I kind of go by sort of rhythm. And then the words will precipitate onto the page, and I revise incessantly and obsessively. We were talking a little bit earlier today with some of the MFA folks that the way I revise is I just revise for precision. I want the sentences to be as precise. I want the language to be as precise as possible, so it's as immersive as possible. It's as immersive as I can make it for the reader. There's always a combination. I mean, some sentences just come out, and the first time you write them, they're absolutely perfect, and you caught them just at the right minute. And other sentences I'll rewrite 35 or 40 times over the course of living with a manuscript of a novel over 5 or 6 years.
Excellent. Lisa said, I know seeds of this story came from your family history. How do you blend fact with fiction in a way that maintains the integrity of both?
Good question. So this one, the new one, this other Eden, has none of my family in it. There are aspects of it. I have 3 novels, and they're all sort of interconnected. Parts of all of them take place in a fictionalized version of the town in which I grew up. I grew up in a little town in Massachusetts called Wenham, which in the books is called Enon. But in Tinkers, the basic load-bearing dramatic premises of Tinkers all came from my maternal grandfather's stories that he would tell us about his pretty tough life growing up in northern Maine. And I actually started trying to write what became Tinkers as nonfiction, just as memories for posterity. About sort of family chronicles. And the problem I had was that when I was writing purely factual family history, I found that I did not have the ability to assign relative value or weight or importance to different subjects. because to me, it was just my grandfather, and every single thing about him was important, like equally important, of equal, it's just invaluable. So what I was able to do is just pull back a little bit and make the character, make some of the characters, mostly the one that was based on my grandfather, because the other characters were people in previous generations I'd never met, so I could make up versions of them more easily. I just stepped back and just had that extra little bit of just sort of artistic, as it were, distance, and turned him into an imagined version of my grandfather than my grandfather per se. And that gave me just enough so that I could turn him into a character that I could work with, who I could then, as the story came to me, I could freely avail myself of fact whenever it worked, and or my imagination whenever that worked. And so it just took a little while to get used to it, but then it just became seamless. There are actually parts of Tinkers that I asked my mother about it too, that I can no longer remember if they're things my grandfather actually told me or if I made them up. But there's that beautiful thing about fiction is true. It's just the distinct. I think sometimes we equate fact with the truth, or we limit the truth to fact, when there is imaginative truth as well. And so I was able to do that synthesis, that combination, and use that calculus of the synthesis between factual truth and imaginative truth. So they came together to make, just the book had its own kind of inner, artistic truth or whatever, dramatic truth.
Excellent. Anya said, in personal experience, I've found that different kinds of music can have a big impact on storytelling. How did your background in music inspire your writing? And does your experience in playing the drums affect the way you pace your prose?
Yeah, the drums absolutely affects the way that I write my prose, because I love that. Well, so that, the kind of corny formulation is that it's kind of all music. It's the music of the spheres. The sun is like a big gong, everything's reverberating, and so the drums are just rhythmic. That kind of, and when you're the drummer, you're the timekeeper. You keep time, and so you can slow things down when you're playing. When a song down, when you're playing, you can slow it down. You can speed it up. You can force it. You can double time. You can halve time. All that. That's what I think of what I'm doing when I'm writing narrative. Working with narrative time, so I keep time, and I do that very rhythmically. I also think language, I think it's kind of true that all spoken language is basically incantation, song, as it were, prayer, psalms, all that. So I definitely also have music, tonality and rhythm, and that sort of the shaped kind of thing. So what was the other part of the question? Sorry, I'm just sort of going out discursively,
Oh no, I think that was spot on. Yeah, she was just asking about if that history with the drums helped you pace your prose. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other, I just listen to music all the time. I'm a kind of an analog hi-fi nerd. I've got a old all tube amp, and I play records all the time. And I love all kinds of music, just tons and tons of classical music, tons of jazz, tons of rock, folk, whatever. Just always listen to it. I don't listen to music when I write though, because I find it distracts me. But if you listen to music when you write, it's totally cool. Like any of you don't, there's no rule against it.
All right. Becky said, in Tinkers, you often move into an almost celestial meta world, sometimes planting characters in a space between reality and imagination. First, she said, this is beautiful and I love it. But my question is, do you find this is your writing style in general? And do you naturally move into this space while you write?
I'd say the short answer is, yeah, it's just, and we were talking earlier today, every writer should just feel free to, and unself-conscious, but self-aware, to give in to her own deepest impulses. And I'm kind of a metaphysician. I love the transcendentalists. I read tons of philosophy. I read tons of theology, particularly the theologian I've come to love is a Swiss Reformed theologian named Karl Barth. And he's like all respectable Swiss theologians. He's a church dogmatics that's like 20,000 pages long. And I love like Emerson might call it, Ralph Waldo Emerson might call it the drama of consciousness. There's, nothing more complex has been observed in the universe than the human brain. I couldn't be less interested in myself as a subject, but I couldn't be more interested in the fact that I am a self. The given selfhood is just a great mystery to me that I love. And so I always want to be able to write about that. And then, it's fun because then when you write a certain way, every way that you write or whatever your natural inclination is always brings up a very predictable set of certain difficulties. So one of the things I found is that when I started trying to write fiction, that kind of that fiction that's kind of, coextensive, the inside and the outside are coextensive. The problem is I just, wrote about, all my characters would have just been people who just like lay on couches eating potato chips and thinking, So one of the fun challenges for Tinkers was, I said, if this guy's just lying in bed and the whole thing's happening in his mind, based, as it were, it's all true, what if, the challenge that I would set for myself was that the most prominent immediate danger would always be that the prose would lapse into abstraction, theoretical, kind of philosophical, conceptual abstraction. And I didn't want that. I wanted it absolutely embodied. I wanted it imminent, right? So I just said, I'm going to have this book so that if you take the book and you start fanning through the pages and you stop at any page and you look away and you put your finger down, it will be a concrete noun or verb. And that was really cool because then what that did was it brought up types of writing I never, ever, ever could have gotten to. I couldn't have thought them up ahead of time and then just deployed them. It sort of, they elaborated themselves in these beautiful, like surprising ways that I just was happy to be audience to a lot of the time.
Excellent. Rebecca said, this is a big question, but I've loved your emphasis on students and teaching writing as you've spoken this morning. What do you wish more young writers knew? Or what is something you like to tell your students that you could share with writers here today?
Oh, I wish we had more time together. The emphasis changes. I mean, more and more, I feel like one of my prime things as a teacher is to aid and abet you in cultivating your own intellectual and aesthetic autonomy. The idea that you should not second guess your own deepest impulses. A lot of times we're sort of self-conscious or we're worried about, like, is that what a real writer would do? Is that, I might be, that might go against what the grain is these days or whatever. And so I want people to just be able to become less self-conscious and more self-aware and just give themselves over to what they'll be most attentive to and what they care most about. Because if you're writing about what you care most about, you'll pay the best attention you can to it. And that attentiveness gives value. That to which we pay attention is valuable. Like that's it. And you'll take care of the writing. You'll want to get it just right. I also find myself teaching more and more just some of the technical aspects of writing. I think writing, unlike a lot of other art forms, there still clings to it this kind of romanticism that's not necessarily helpful, that you don't, book learning might ruin the purity of your vision, but English language works in certain mechanical ways, and so it's good to technically know how, and particularly there are technical aspects that are particular to narrative prose, to writing fiction, that I find every time I think, oh, this is where everybody's going to get bored to death. Talk about how you work on scene and everybody seems to love it because it's a concrete thing. When you're trying to come up with so much truth and beauty, what you can kind of feel like you shot past the kind of peg that you want to hang that on, like the kind of the concrete kind of technical aspects of it. And I was very much when I was an MFA student, I was very much that sort of, don't slow me down with grammar. I'm just burning, baby. I just gonna burn. I was tell a story that I was graduating. And my sort of mentor and ongoing very close friend, Marilyn Robinson, novelist and essayist Marilyn Robinson, I was having my exit interview with her the last day of my MFA, and I felt very, very full of myself. I felt like I had the tiara and the roses and big Iowa Writers Workshop. I was leaving her room and walking out, and the door was closing behind me, and she called to me and she said, "Paul," and I said, "Yes, Marilyn, what other compliment do you have to pay me," kind of thing. And she said, "You really should learn how to write grammatically correct English prose. That's as I was walking out, and it was sort of like the best advice I ever got, you know. So that's another thing. You just learn to just like love the English, love the language, and love how it works, and love how, you know, from the words to the way that sentences work, and the way, like the morphology even of how English and sentences have worked over the years. So I have a hardcover copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, the 20 volumes. So I'll get up in the morning and get my cornflakes and like look at G, you know, just go down into the language, and just luxuriate in it. And read Shakespeare and read Tyndall's translations of the Bible, and just, you know, like that beautiful, like all the great capacity for meaning and beauty that the language has.
All right, Shayla said, who are some of your biggest literary inspirations, and what are your favorite pieces of literature? Are there any writers or works that have inspired your books and your writing specifically?
Oh, there's millions of them. You know, I don't think people worry about this so much anymore, but I used to get the questions about sort of like, do you not read books while you're writing? So you get like plausible deniability. You know, something I talk about with my own students all the time is like, you're always right. You know, I think a lot of writers become writers because they're such avid readers, and at a certain point, the books you love the books you love so much that it won't just do to just read them again. You have to kind of start answering back to them. You kind of end up sort of, you know, making your work, you know, synthesized with theirs. So to me, it's never the anxiety of influence, it's the privilege of influence. It's the privilege of being a part of a tradition. So when people look at thinkers and they say, oh, do you read Emerson? Do you read Emily Dickinson? You bet your bootstraps I do, you know? So I mean, I have all sorts of, the writers that first maybe wanted to write were the then so-called magical realists, Carlos Fuentes and Julio Cortázar and Marquez and those people. And then the writers that more, you know, I love Faulkner, I love Emily Dickinson. I mean, there's too many, I'm always afraid I'm going to leave somebody out. The Transcendentalists, certainly. And then, you know, I tell students that, and again, I put this as if it's the gospel truth, but it's, you know, just the spirit of the thing. But the more I teach, the more I write, the more I read, the more I think your writing can kind of, in some ways, only be as good as the best books you read. Because then you know where your own writing stands. It can be very humbling, if not humiliating, but just that idea of you see what the art can do. And I think not only can your writing only be as good as the best books you read, but it can only be as good as the best readings you give of the best books. And so I always put everything I read right into my manuscripts, you know. And then it's how do you make it so you're deepening, you're participating in that tradition without just being merely imitative or derivative. But lately, for the past several years, I have just almost been exclusively teaching this sort of like just loop of Shakespeare and the Old Testament. It's cut straight to the chase, like Moses and Shakespeare. And partially that's just wonderful, because then you can see, you know, Moses, you know, the Old Testament its influence was old Babylonian and Egyptian literature that it took and made, and then you can see Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is full of the Bible, and then you know all this, and then you read Moby Dick again, and you realize there's not a page of Moby Dick that doesn't have some of the Old Testament in it and some of Shakespeare in it. And then you read, say, Faulkner, like The Bear, you know, Faulkner's novella The Bear, which is like Melville's Moby Dick. It's the woods were his Harvard College and his Yale, and there's all this echoic stuff in The Bear from Moby Dick. So then you start saying, oh, I'm like reading, like it's a series of lenses, and you're saying I'm looking, you know, I'm reading Faulkner, reading Melville, reading Shakespeare, reading Moses, reading, and you just suddenly you're aligned with that tradition, and so you become contemporary with all of those people, and it's something deeply, you know, you feel deeply connected to like the fiat lux of it all, you know. And so you think, I want to align myself with that, and that's what I think everybody does with their favorite authors, one way or another. And you should never. Not only should you feel self-conscious about it. You should feel self-aware about it and give yourself over to it and just let it rip, you know?
Excellent. Lincoln said, how does a writer reconcile her deepest impulses with critical feedback in the workshop model?
So that's one of those participatory or experiential things where workshops are great for testing. Well, workshops are an opportunity for you to ponder the discrepancies, greater or smaller, between your intended meaning and the effective meaning of your work. And then what you learn in this effort towards intellectual and artistic autonomy is you learn how to evaluate what other people say about your work, and you learn how to accept and reject it according to what you are, what you think your need, what your true vision is. All that Walt Whitman stuff about anything that insults your soul, anything that insults your sense, you just chuck it. But that, of course, then means there has to be a corresponding constant self-examination. I mean, I also have to say, am I sticking to my guns and being loyal to myself, or am I just being an intractable pain in the neck to my editor? So you say, you have to be open to having things shown to you that you might not see, you might not finding, especially in workshops. Sometimes it's just like, I don't like that person very much, but they just told me something true. They're just learning how to just sort of be able to hear what you need to hear, but then saying, well, you're not my reader. You're not the right source for me to find, to keep my work oriented towards its true north.
All right. Cassidy said, in your novel Tinkers, you describe elements of Howard's life who is epileptic.
Mm-hmm.
How did you decide to give him epilepsy, and what gave you the confidence to write from an epileptic perspective?
That's the perfect question, because I never in 1,000 years would have assigned epilepsy to a character, precisely because it's very difficult to write about. It's very like seizure disorders generally too. They have this historical kind of vibe attached to them with they've been considered holy, or they've been considered sort of mystical or whatever. And I really was just like, oh geez, I don't want to get into the thicket of this. But again, that idea of not, sometimes when you face the toughest complications in your writing, you got to just write your way through it. One of the non-negotiable factual dramatic premises of Tinkers was that my great-grandfather did have epilepsy. So I couldn't make it something else. I decided to keep it. So what I realized is the way to write about epilepsy was to arrange it so the subject is always the character Howard. Howard is the character who has epilepsy. Everything I write is about Howard, who has epilepsy. Epilepsy is a predicate, always a predicate or an object of this subject, Howard, who has that. So when you align that conceptually, then narratively and grammatically, what you do is I never write about, if you look at Tinkers, I never write about epilepsy as a subject in and of itself. The success or the reader's consent to Howard and to the book never ever is in the balance, or is never rests on me getting the reader to believe something objective about epilepsy first, and having that be the condition upon which then they consent to believing in Howard. So what I did is I just said I didn't research any epilepsy. I said just nothing about epilepsy. Everything about epilepsy is Howard's experience of it. So to him, having an epileptic fit is like being struck by lightning. If I said that objectively, you have to believe that before you can come into my art, you might just say, well, thanks, but no thanks. But if I say, I'm just describing to him, this was his experience, it was experiential. So I'm privileging the subject and his experience. Who could begrudge somebody their own experience of that sort of a thing, And I did, the one thing I did know about epilepsy is that it was like a neuroelectrical situation, so that electricity would not be an imprecise or inaccurate metaphor to elaborate. And one of the wonderful things is that been all around the world reading, and so many people have come up to me and said, I have a seizure disorder, I have epilepsy, and you've got it exactly right. And I just have to say, go art, because I had, so that was really, really wonderful.
Excellent. Well, our last question is from Chanel, and she says, can you just ballpark when this next book is coming out?
I thought it was going to be coming out in like 2018. There's just a series of, I was working on it for years, and then I was working on it with my editor from Random House, a woman named Susan Camel, and we were kind of getting ready to sort of start maybe thinking about galleys and this and that. And she unexpectedly just tragically died. She got cancer and died like within weeks of being diagnosed, and that kind of put Random House into a tailspin for a while. So the book and I were sort of on hold for a long time, and then it took them several months to hire her replacement, and then for us to decide that would be my new editor, for that editor to get so. And with the pandemic, publishing's all screwy. Anyways, I'm hoping February. Oh, geez, I don't know. I really don't know. I'm sort of hoping this upcoming fall, but it's already a little bit too late for that. So it might be spring of 2022, I think. Might be.
All right. Well, thanks again. I wish you could see the faces of everyone and hear their praises. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you all. It was just such a great time spending. It was so wonderful to spend time with all of you today. Really shot in the arm. This is the tonic that we all need to keep civilization going, during these tough times. So thank you all. Much, much obliged.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining the series this week. And don't forget to visit the links in the chat window. And remember, same time next week for a reading by Rick Barrett. We'll see you then.